The biting wind was a constant companion, a low, mournful howl that seeped through the reinforced walls of the Antarctic research base, 3 months of darkness beginning. It was a sound I'd grown accustomed to, a lullaby of isolation that had replaced the vibrant symphony of stars I once chased. My name is Dean. I'm an astrophysicist, or at least, that's what the chipped name tag on my worn parka still insists. These days, the title felt as hollow as the vast, frozen plains outside. 3 months. 3 months of perpetual night. The sun had dipped below the horizon weeks ago, leaving us in a realm of perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the sterile glow of floodlights and the faint, spectral dance of the aurora borealis. It was beautiful, in a desolate, terrifying way. The kind of beauty that made I feel impossibly small, a speck of dust clinging to a forgotten rock. My days here had blurred into a monotonous cycle. Wake, coffee, check the array readings, more coffee, stare at the same data streams, attempt to decipher patterns that weren't there, and sleep. The grand cosmic questions that had once set my soul alight now felt like distant echoes, drowned out by the persistent hum of the generators and the gnawing emptiness in my gut. I used to pore over nebulae images, tracing the delicate tendrils of interstellar gas, imagining the birth of stars. Now my gaze was fixed on the dull, predictable flicker of sensor readouts, searching for what exactly? A confirmation that the universe was as indifferent as it seemed. My colleagues were ghosts, phantoms flitting through the corridors, their faces etched with the same weary resignation. We spoke in clipped sentences, our conversations limited to equipment malfunctions and ration reports. There was a time, I remembered, when I craved this solitude, this escape from the clamor of the world. I'd envisioned a quiet sanctuary where I could finally dedicate myself to the universe, undisturbed. I remember the exhilaration, the sheer, unadulterated joy of discovering something new. But the universe, it seemed, was a stingy storyteller. It offered glimpses, tantalizing hints, but always pulled back the curtain before the full truth could be revealed. The main observation hub was a sterile, utilitarian space, filled with humming consoles and blinking lights. It smelled faintly of ozone and stale coffee. I sat at my usual station, the worn armrest cool beneath my elbow. The monitors displayed a cascade of numbers, lines, and spectral graphs, the heartbeat of the cosmos, filtered through our instruments. Most of it was noise, the universe's casual exhalations, the background radiation of creation. I'd learned to filter it, to tune it out, to find a semblance of peace in the predictable chaos. Tonight, however, something was different, a subtle deviation, a tremor in the usual rhythm. It began as a barely perceptible blip on the long-range spectral analysis, a faint anomaly in Sector 7G. Not unusual, really. Equipment glitches were as common as the frost on the windows. I'd seen countless false positives, phantom signals born of atmospheric interference or sensor fatigue. I almost dismissed it, almost returned to the comforting monotony of the known. But this one lingered. It didn't fade. Instead, it sharpened, coalescing into a distinct, non-random pattern. My fingers, acting on instinct honed by years of relentless pursuit, moved across the keyboard. I isolated the frequency, amplifying the signal, my breath catching in my throat. The hum of the generators seemed to recede, replaced by a prickling tension that crawled across my skin. The pattern was unlike anything I had ever encountered. It wasn't the familiar signature of pulsars, quasars, or even the faint, ancient echo of the Big Bang. This was structured, deliberate. It pulsed with an alien rhythm, a language I couldn't comprehend, yet somehow instinctively recognized as profound. My gaze flickered to the coordinates displayed on the screen. Sector 7G, a region of space charted as virtually empty, devoid of any significant celestial bodies, a cosmic dead zone. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the spectral graph. The pulses grew stronger, more defined, each one a distinct crystalline note in an unknown cosmic symphony. It was as if something was intentionally reaching out, a deliberate transmission from an unimaginable distance. The air in the hub grew heavy, thick with an unspoken question. What was out there in the absolute emptiness that could send such a message? The wind outside the Antarctic research base, 3 months of darkness beginning, was a living thing. It scraped against the metal shell of our compound, a constant, abrasive whisper that burrowed into my bones. It had been 3 months since the sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging us into this perpetual twilight, and the signal had arrived just last week. It was a phantom limb of the universe, a phantom limb I was desperate to understand. I hunched over the console, the pale blue light of the monitor reflecting in my tired eyes. The signal wasn't just a signal, it was a pattern, a complex, deliberate sequence that defied every known astrophysical phenomenon. It wasn't a pulsar, not a quasar, not even the faint hum of background radiation. This was intentional. My fingers danced across the keyboard, isolating frequencies, cross-referencing data streams. Each iteration of the analysis chipped away at my skepticism, replacing it with a gnawing unease. The source was impossible. The coordinates pointed to a sector of space that was, by all current astronomical understanding, utterly devoid of matter. Nothing. I turned to see the base's grizzled engineer, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease and whose face was a roadmap of hard-won experience. He leaned against the doorway, a steaming mug clutched in his mittened hands. "Just looking into something," I replied, my voice raspy. I gestured vaguely at the screen. "An anomaly," grunted, shuffling closer. The faint smell of burnt oil and something vaguely metallic clung to him. He peered at the cascading lines of data, his brow furrowed. "Looks like static to me, probably some interference from the ionosphere. This far south, things get weird." "It's not static," I said, my voice a little too sharp. I regretted it immediately. He was trying to be helpful in his own way. "It's too structured, too deliberate." He took a slow sip of his drink. "Deliberate? You think the universe is sending us a postcard, Dean?" A wry smile touched his lips, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, something that mirrored my own growing disquiet. He'd been out here for years, seen more Antarctic winters than I cared to count. He knew what isolation did to a person. "I don't know what I think," I admitted, running a hand through my already disheveled hair. "But this isn't natural. The energy signature, the frequency modulation. It's unlike anything I've ever encountered. It's too clean, too precise. Like and it's coming from nowhere." I spent the next few hours alone, the engineer's skepticism a dull throb in the back of my mind. I amplified the signal, stripping away layers of what I now suspected was deliberate obfuscation. It was like peeling back the bark of an ancient tree, revealing not rings of growth, but something else entirely. The signal wasn't just a sequence, it was a carrier wave. And on it, buried deep, were echoes, not of sound, but of something far more fundamental. Patterns that spoke of vast distances, of unimaginable timescales, of geometries that made my head ache. I began to notice subtle shifts in the signal, a rhythmic pulsation that wasn't part of the original data stream. It was like a heartbeat, faint but insistent, overlaid on the more complex structure. I ran diagnostics, checked for equipment malfunctions, for atmospheric disturbances. The pulsation was inherent to the signal itself. It was as if whatever was broadcasting this impossible message was alive. A shiver traced its way down my spine, independent of the frigid air. I pulled up the spectrographic analysis again. The visual representation of the signal was a jagged, almost organic line, unlike the smooth curves of natural phenomena. And then, for the first time, I saw it. A recurring motif within the larger pattern. A symbol, abstract and alien, that seemed to shift and reform as I looked at it, never quite resolving into a definable shape. The wind outside seemed to deepen its lament, a guttural moan that vibrated through the floor. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the instinctive awareness of being watched. But there was no one. And why was it calling to me here at the edge of the world? The hum of the servers was a low, constant drone, a lullaby I'd grown accustomed to in the sterile quiet of the Antarctic research base. 3 months of darkness beginning. Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge, a sound that usually seeped into my bones but today felt distant, muffled by the sheer intensity of what I was doing. The engineer's dismissive tone still echoed in my ears, a phantom whisper against the cacophony of data flowing across my screens. Obfuscation, that was the word. It wasn't just noise, it was a carefully constructed wall, a deliberate attempt to hide something. I leaned closer, the recycled air from the vents carrying a faint metallic tang. My eyes burned, dry and gritty, but I couldn't pull away. Hours blurred into a single agonizing stretch of focus. Each processed bite, each filtered frequency, felt like chipping away at an impossibly dense rock. It was structured, impossibly so, not like any natural phenomenon I'd ever encountered, not like anything humanity had ever produced. This was deliberate, ancient. The lines of code scrolled, each character a tiny brick in the edifice of my growing unease. I isolated a repeating pattern, a complex series of pulses that defied any known mathematical progression. It wasn't a language in the human sense, no nouns or verbs. It was something far more fundamental, a direct expression of something. My breath hitched. I ran the decryption algorithms again, tweaking parameters, pushing the processing power of the base's network to its absolute limit. The fans whirred louder, a desperate, straining sound. Then it happened. A segment of the signal, previously buried under layers of interference, resolved itself. It wasn't audio, not visual. It was information. Raw, unadulterated data, like a blueprint for existence itself. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if the air itself was growing heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The lights in the lab flickered, a brief, disquieting stutter. The data resolved into a three-dimensional schematic. It wasn't a star chart or a planet or a nebula, it was a structure. Vast, impossibly complex. Its geometry defied Euclidean principles, bending and folding in on itself in ways that made my head ache. It pulsed with an internal light, a slow, rhythmic throb that seemed to resonate with the very core of my being. I zoomed in, tracing the lines of this edifice. It stretched for light years. It was not in space, it was space, or at least a manipulation of it on a scale that made my astrophysics textbooks seem like children's scribbles. My gut twisted. This wasn't a signal from somewhere. It was a signal of something, a manifestation. The engineer's words, just static, felt like a cruel joke now. This was the opposite of static. This was a deliberate, monumental declaration. I traced a specific node within the structure, a point of intense energy concentration. The signal was emanating from there. A single point, impossibly small in the grand scheme of the structure, yet the source of this cosmic broadcast. My eyes scanned the coordinates, cross-referencing them with the deep space survey data. An empty sector. Absolutely, unequivocally empty. I ran a spectral analysis on the origin point. The results were nonsensical. There was no known element, no energy signature that fit any known physical law. It was a signature of absence, paradoxically radiating a palpable presence. It was like staring into a black hole and seeing it wink back. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration started in the floor beneath my feet. It wasn't the usual shudder of the ice shelf or the groan of the base settling. This was different, deeper, more resonant. It felt organic. My gaze snapped up from the screen, sweeping across the lab. Everything appeared normal. The racks of equipment hummed, the monitors displayed their intricate patterns. But the vibration persisted, a subtle tremor that seemed to emanate from within the very rock beneath the base. I stood up, my legs feeling suddenly weak. The schematic on the screen pulsed, and for a fleeting moment, I could have sworn I saw one of its impossibly complex geometries shift, reform, as if in response to my observation. The vibration intensified, a low thrumming that I could feel in my teeth. A faint, almost subliminal clicking sound began to weave itself into the hum of the servers, a sound like chitin on stone. It was coming from outside, or was it from inside? My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. What was this place? And what was it doing? Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge, a sound that usually seeped into my bones but today felt distant, muffled by the sheer impenetrability of the reinforced walls. 3 months. 3 months of perpetual night, of the sun a forgotten memory. It was supposed to be a retreat, a place to escape the noise, the endless chatter of a world obsessed with the trivial. I'd come here for the silence, for the raw, unadulterated void of space that I could observe from this frozen perch. It was full of that signal. I ran my hand over the cool, smooth surface of my console. The anomaly hadn't just persisted, it had grown. Not in amplitude, no, that would have been too simple, too measurable. It was more insidious. It had woven itself into the very fabric of the data streams, a subtle distortion, like a ripple on a perfectly still pond that I can't quite pinpoint the origin of. My colleagues, the other scientists and technicians who shared this isolated outpost, were oblivious. They saw nothing, heard nothing. They were content with their routine, their predictable experiments, their carefully curated isolation. I couldn't blame them. The truth was a venomous thing, and I was beginning to suspect I was the only one it had bitten. Last night, it had been the light. A flicker, just at the edge of my vision, in the periphery of the laboratory where I spent most of my waking hours. Not the steady glow of the overhead fluorescence, but something organic. A brief, incandescent pulse that seemed to emanate from the data readouts themselves. I'd spun around, heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing. Just the hum, the stark white walls, the endless lines of code scrolling across my monitors. But the memory clung to me, a persistent itch under my skin. Now, as I sipped my lukewarm coffee, the air in the common area felt thick, charged. Every creak of the metal structure, every groan of the ice shifting beneath us felt amplified, deliberate. I found myself listening, waiting for a sound that wasn't there. It was the feeling of being watched. Not by human eyes, but by something vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. The signal was a key, I was sure of it, a key to a door I'd never known existed, and on the other side, I shivered again. I tried to explain it, of course, to the lead engineer, a gruff man with perpetually grease-stained hands. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed, and then suggested I recalibrate my optical sensors. He'd even offered me a mild sedative. I hadn't taken it. How could I explain that the anomaly wasn't just in the data but in the air, that it was a pressure, a weight, pressing down on my consciousness? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could shut it down. The transmission protocols were within my grasp. A few keystrokes, and the anomalous signal would cease to be. The pressure would lift. I could go back to being the disillusioned astrophysicist, the man who sought solace in the stars. But the thought felt like a betrayal, a surrender. I looked at the main monitor, at the swirling fractal patterns that represented the signal's waveform. It was beautiful in a terrifying, alien way. It was a language I was beginning to understand, not with my mind, but with something deeper, something primal. It spoke of immensity, of timescales that dwarfed human history, of intelligences that operated on principles I couldn't even begin to grasp. And then it happened again. This time it wasn't a flicker. It was a movement, a shift in the very perception of the room. The hum of the servers seemed to warp, to deepen into a resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. I saw it then, reflected in the polished metal of a nearby server rack. A distortion, a tear in the fabric of the room. Not a hole, but a bending. And within that distortion, for a fleeting instant, I thought I saw a shape. It was too vast, too formless to truly comprehend. A suggestion of geometry that defied Euclidean space, a presence that felt like the crushing weight of 1,000 atmospheres. It was the signal made manifest. It was here. My breath hitched, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My eyes were drawn against my will to the flickering distortion. It was beckoning, inviting. There was this the confrontation. There was this the moment the universe revealed its true, monstrous face. The distortion pulsed, a silent invitation. What was it? And what would happen if I stepped into the bending? Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge, a sound that usually seeped into my bones but today felt distant, muffled by the sheer wrongness of it all. The anomaly wasn't just a blip anymore. It was a presence, and it was growing. I traced the spectral lines on the monitor, my fingers leaving faint smudges on the cool glass. The data stream from the deep space array was a chaotic symphony of noise, but beneath it the signal persisted. Not a radio wave, not gravitational distortions, nothing I could categorize with the known physics. It was a pattern, a deliberate, intelligent pulse that seemed to weave through the very fabric of space-time. My colleagues, the other scientists at the base, had dismissed it as equipment malfunction, a solar flare anomaly, anything to avoid the precipice I felt myself teetering on. But I knew better. I'd spent years staring into the void, looking for meaning, for answers. My stomach clenched, a familiar knot of apprehension tightening. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, my mind replaying the raw data, searching for a key, a Rosetta Stone to unlock this cosmic enigma. Now it felt like a cage, the endless white landscape outside a vast, indifferent canvas reflecting my own growing insignificance. I pulled up the archival logs, a digital graveyard of past observations. Nothing. It was as if this signal had just appeared, like a thought forming in a slumbering mind, a thought that was now waking. My gaze drifted to the window, the reinforced glass offering a distorted view of the perpetual twilight. The wind had picked up, a low moan that vibrated through the thick walls of the base. The signal. I needed more data, more context. But the equipment here, state-of-the-art as it was, felt woefully inadequate. It was designed to observe the universe, not to communicate with it, or worse, to be observed by it. I remembered the old research papers, the fringe theories I'd dismissed as academic curiosities. The ones that spoke of ancient cosmic intelligences, of signals that predated humanity, of entities that existed beyond our dimensional understanding. I'd filed them away, irrelevant to my own work on exoplanet atmospheres. Now, those papers felt like prophecies. I accessed the base's secure network, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I needed to find out if anyone else had ever encountered anything like this. I bypassed security protocols I'd helped design, a prickle of guilt warring with my growing urgency. There were encrypted files, hidden deep within the network, meant for restricted access by the highest echelons of the scientific community. Rumors of classified projects, of observations deemed too destabilizing to be released. My heart hammered against my ribs, a primitive drumbeat against the sterile hum of the servers. This was dangerous, not just professionally but existentially. The implications of what I was chasing were staggering. If this was a deliberate transmission, what was its purpose? Was it a greeting, a warning, or something far more sinister? The files began to decrypt, a slow, painstaking process. Each percentage point that ticked by felt like an eternity. The wind outside seemed to intensify, a furious battering against the base, as if the storm itself was reacting to my intrusion. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the distinct feeling of being watched even here, in this isolated outpost at the bottom of the world. Then a file opened. A series of scanned documents brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. They were from decades ago, from an expedition far more daring, far more desperate than our own. It finds the cracks in our understanding and widens them. My breath hitched. Resonance. That felt right. It wasn't just a broadcast, it was something that vibrated with our own reality, something that could interact with it, the same sector where my anomaly was originating. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the base, followed by a cascade of static from the communications array. The hum of the servers wavered, a dying breath. The wind outside shrieked, a sound that no longer felt like weather but like a voice. What had I awakened by digging through these old files? The Antarctic research base, 3 months of darkness beginning, hummed with a low, guttural thrum. It wasn't the familiar whine of generators or the groaning of ice under pressure. This was deeper, a vibration that seemed to originate not from the earth, but from within it and from beyond. Outside, the perpetual twilight pressed against the reinforced windows, a suffocating blanket of bruised purple and bruised black. Inside, the air tasted of ozone and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the tang of old blood. I traced the lines on the schematics, my fingers smudged with the faint residue of the ancient ink. The sector, the anomaly, it wasn't just a point in space. It was a wound. The documents, cryptic as they were, hinted at a confluence, a place where the usual rules of physics frayed, where the veil between here and elsewhere was thin enough for something to seep through. And the signal, my signal, was the echo of its awakening. The rest of the crew, bless their oblivious hearts, were hunkered down, tending to the routine checks, the scheduled maintenance. They noticed the atmospheric shifts, the unusual aurora displays that painted the sky in colors no natural phenomenon should produce. They'd attributed it to solar flares, to magnetic field fluctuations. They hadn't heard the whisper. I had. The thrumming intensified. It was no longer just a sound. It was a pressure, a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. My vision swam. Flecks of light danced at the edges of my sight, coalescing into impossible geometries that flickered and dissolved before I could truly grasp them. The static on my monitor, once a white noise, now seemed to form patterns, fleeting images that hinted at an unfathomable scale. Vast, churning depths, stars like dust motes in an infinite black ocean. A faint scratching sound, not from the ice, from inside the base. I froze, straining my ears. It was coming from the ventilation shaft above my workstation. A soft, rhythmic scrape like fingernails on metal. My gaze snapped upwards. The grate was still in place, bolted tight, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. I pushed my chair back, the wheels squeaking on the polished concrete floor. This was it, the resonance, the interaction. It wasn't just a signal anymore, it was a presence. The scratching stopped. Silence descended, heavy and expectant. Then, a soft pop like a cork being drawn from a bottle. The vent grate shuddered, then slowly, impossibly began to lift. No hands, no visible force. It simply rose as if being nudged by an invisible finger. It was slick, obsidian black, and seemed to absorb the dim overhead light. My breath hitched. It was learning, adapting. I grabbed the emergency comms unit, my hands slick with sweat. I had to warn them. I had to get out. Understanding washed over me. Not my understanding, something else's. A vast, ancient awareness stretching back before the stars themselves. It showed me the futility of escape. The tendril reappeared, thicker this time and longer. More popped from other vents, from cracks in the walls that hadn't been there moments before. They writhed, reaching, exploring. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, acrid, burning my nostrils. The thrumming reached a deafening crescendo, a symphony of impossible frequencies that vibrated through my bones. My vision blurred again, but this time the images were clearer, more terrifying. I saw not just the depths, but the things that swam within them. Shapes that defied geometry, colors that did not exist. The tendrils were reaching for me now. My skin prickled, goose flesh erupting in protest. I could feel them probing, not my flesh, but something deeper, something within my mind. They were sifting through my memories, my fears, my very being. I looked at the schematics again, at the highlighted sector, the wound, the entry point. The document spoke of a way to seal it, a sacrifice, not of life, but of being, a severing, a tearing away. The thrumming was unbearable. It felt like my skull was about to crack. I had to choose, either let this thing consume everything or... My hand hovered over the control panel, my gaze fixed on the emergency lockdown sequence. It would seal the entire base, including me. But it would also sever the connection, the bridge it was using to manifest. It would be a sacrifice. Did I have the strength to do it? The emergency lockdown sequence. My hand trembled above the console, a cold sweat prickling my brow. The hum of the bass, usually a comforting drone, now felt like a prelude to a scream. Each tick of the chronometer on the wall was a hammer blow against my resolve. It was a choice between oblivion and... What? I slammed my palm down. The klaxons blared, a jarring, insistent shriek that echoed through the metal corridors of the Antarctic research base, 3 months of darkness beginning. Red lights pulsed, bathing the sterile environment in an infernal glow. The heavy blast doors groaned, sliding shut with a deafening clang, sealing off sectors with a finality that vibrated through my bones. I could feel it, a wrenching, tearing sensation, as if something vast and unseen was being violently expelled. Slowly, painfully, the klaxons died. The pulsing red lights switched off, plunging the control room back into the dim, utilitarian white of the emergency lighting. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, a desperate, ragged rhythm against the vast emptiness. I leaned back in the chair, my legs suddenly weak. My knuckles were white, my fingers imprinted with the rough texture of the console. It was done. The bridge was severed. The thing was gone, but the silence was a new kind of terror. I scanned the readouts. The anomalous energy signatures, the ones that had pulsed with such malevolent intent, were gone, vanished. The spectral readings, the impossible geometries that had flickered at the edge of my vision, were absent. My eyes drifted to the main display. The star chart, once a comforting tapestry of familiar constellations, now seemed wrong, distorted, a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible warping of the celestial bodies. Had I imagined it, there was the stress finally getting to me. I ran a hand over my face, the stubble rough against my palm. The base was sealed. That was the immediate aftermath. A self-imposed exile, a prison, but I had stopped it. I had slammed the door shut. Hadn't I? I froze. My head snapped up, straining to hear over the dull throb of my own pulse. It was faint, almost subliminal, like an insect trapped in a wall. It came from the comms panel. I had shut down all external communications, severed the connection. Yet, I pushed myself up, my movements stiff. My boots crunched on something small and granular on the floor. I looked down. Tiny fragments of what looked like shattered glass, impossibly fine, dusted the console and the floor. They glinted faintly in the emergency lights. Where had they come from? The windows were intact. The reinforced viewport to the outside was a solid, unbroken sheet of thick acrylic. The scratching came again, a little louder this time. It was coming from inside the comms unit. A rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I pressed my ear against it. The tapping stopped. Instead, a soft, wet sound, like something being dragged across metal. My breath hitched. I pulled back, my heart a frantic bird trapped in my chest. This was something smaller, more insidious. I backed away, my gaze fixed on the comms panel. The small glass fragments seemed to shimmer, their edges impossibly sharp. I had sealed the door, but what if something had already slipped through? What if the bridge, even as it collapsed, had left behind a seed? The scratching started again, a persistent, deliberate sound. It was no longer coming from the comms panel. It was coming from inside the control room, from the ventilation grate above my head. Was I truly alone? The air in the control room of the Antarctic research base, 3 months of darkness beginning, was thick with the coppery tang of ozone. It clung to the back of my throat, a constant reminder of the energy surge, of the impossible thing I'd witnessed. My hands, still slick with a cold sweat, traced the cool metal of the console. The fine dust of shattered glass, impossibly small, glinted under the weak emergency lighting. Each speck seemed to hold a captured star, a miniature universe of its own. It was everywhere. On the floor, on the blinking panels, clinging to my suit like a second skin. I'd seen it. Not with my eyes, not truly. It was more of a gnawing, a ripple through the very structure of my perception. Not with words, not with images, but with a shattering of what I understood to be real. The glass dust, I now understood, was the residue of that interaction. The physical manifestation of a conceptual explosion. A low hum vibrated through the deck plating beneath my boots, a sound that had been a comforting constant just hours ago, but now felt like the slow, deliberate grinding of tectonic plates. Something that had been briefly, terribly invited in. I stood, testing my legs. They felt heavy, as if the very air was resisting my movement. The blizzard raged, a white shroud that had descended with unsettling speed, cutting us off from any hope of immediate rescue. We were truly alone, suspended in the perpetual night of the Antarctic winter, with the memory of something ancient and vast seared into my mind. I remembered the fleeting glimpse, the impression of impossible geometries, of colors that had no name, of a scale that dwarfed galaxies. It wasn't a creature, not in any way I could define. It was a concept, a fundamental discord in the symphony of existence that had briefly, terrifyingly, brushed against our fragile reality. My work, my life's pursuit of understanding the cosmos, had led me to a precipice from which I could see the terrifying, indifferent truth. We were not the architects of this universe, but merely a fleeting thought in a mind that had no beginning and no end. The signal was gone, vanished. The console displayed only static, a comforting, meaningless white noise, but the absence was more unnerving than its presence had been. It was like a phantom limb, the feeling of something that should be there but wasn't. Had I pushed it back? Had the surge of raw energy from the amplification system, designed to probe the deepest reaches of space, somehow been enough to momentarily disrupt its attention? Or had it simply moved on? A shiver, unrelated to the sub-zero temperatures outside, snaked down my spine. The thought of it simply moving on was far more terrifying. If it was a cosmic entity of such unfathomable power, what did it mean for it to simply pass through our little corner of the universe? Was this a common occurrence? Had it always been here, just beyond our senses, and I had, through sheer hubris, ripped aside the veil? I walked to the main viewport, my boots crunching on the persistent glass dust. Outside, the snow whipped horizontally, a furious white curtain. It was beautiful in a desolate, unforgiving way. A fitting backdrop for the profound isolation I now felt. My colleagues were asleep, or perhaps still in shock. I hadn't seen them since the incident. They didn't want to know. They couldn't. My words, even filtered through the technical jargon of my profession, were too alien, too damning. I looked at the readouts on a secondary monitor. Atmospheric pressure stable. Internal temperature holding. Power reserves at 70% and slowly depleting. All the mundane metrics of survival in this unforgiving environment. But none of them accounted for the gnawing emptiness inside me, the profound sense of insignificance that had replaced my once burning curiosity. The universe was not a place of wonder to be catalogued and understood. It was a vast, indifferent ocean, and we were but tiny specks of dust adrift on its surface, utterly at the mercy of currents we could not perceive, and storms that could obliterate us without a second thought. I touched the cool glass of the viewport. The dust adhered to my fingertips, a tangible reminder of the breach. It was real, it had happened, waiting, observing, and perhaps, just perhaps, remembering me. The static on the main console flickered. For a fraction of a second it resolved into a pattern, a complex, repeating fractal that seemed to stretch into infinity. Then it was gone, swallowed by the white noise once more. Was it a message, a farewell, or just a random fluctuation in the dying echoes of the anomaly? I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my chest. What was that pattern?